to go through, I'm telling you as we get this going, it will go, that we're going to go through a number of tales. And the tales have to do with a bank teller who is robbed one too many times. Okay. Now, I hope you can see that now.
Yes.
Okay. And so I will change the slides just manually. No one comes to me with a good story, okay? These are all people who have been involved in injuries, insults, disappointments of a magnitude that you don't want to hopefully ever have to experience. There's no such thing as a simple claim in psychiatry that's related to work. These are people that have had combined physical and mental injuries. The physical injury is often serious, if not catastrophic. The psychiatric claims with no physical injuries are the result of what we would call critical incidents, like shootings. Cumulative stress is not because your boss doesn't like you. It's because you're working as a first responder and you've seen one too many bad things. So we're going to start off with chapter 1 in the book. This is a case that involves both acute and cumulative trauma. It's a case of a woman I call Mariana. She's not a complainer. And as you'll see towards the end, I could have probably done more for Mariana. The book has my photos in it. We'll start off with chapter 1. Mariana came into my office scared, tense, and understandably mistrustful. This wasn't the first time she'd been involved in an armed robbery. It was the 4th time in a decade. Just her luck. And the last person to rob her was someone she least expected. As Willie Sutton was claimed to have replied when asked by a reporter why he robbed banks, because that's where the money is. Banks get held up, according to FBI statistics. In the decade ending in 2018, 3,000 to more than 6,000 banks, savings and loans, and credit unions are robbed each year across America. And so I met with Mariana on our first occasion in my office, which was at that time in the Pacific Heights area of San Francisco on Fillmore Street. And we would meet there once every week or two for the next 2 years. She had been on duty in April 1974 in a takeover style robbery by the Symbionese Liberation Army. If you remember, they were the folks who had kidnapped Patty Hearst, and Mariana got through that. Some time went by and she was robbed by a black man who instructed her not to have done any funny stuff, but it was too late. She had already put a transponder and bait money in with the money, which were found by the police in a garbage can about a block away. So she lived in terror that this man would make good on his promise to come back after her. And while she was off the teller line, Mariana witnessed a coworker of hers robbed by a Hispanic man. When they told her it was her time to go back on the teller line, she did so. And she basically described that when men of color would come into the bank, she would take a break and go to the bathroom and hope they would be gone. So this is the last day that Mariana worked. The blonde was well-dressed, wearing the kind of pinstripe business suit that associates at pricey law firms wear. She waited patiently while Mariana finished up an account transaction. The woman in the suit handed Mariana a deposit slip, but no check, no money, only a written message. Put the large bills in an envelope, keep smiling. This is not a joke, now. This isn't right, thought Mariana. This person's not black, not a guy, dressed like an accountant, an attorney, a bank auditor, but not like a bank robber. Excuse me, is there a problem? It was the branch manager noticing something odd in Mariana's appearance. She snapped to and assured the manager everything was in order. Meanwhile, the security guard was helping an older man with the door. The blonde slipped her right hand inside a handbag. Does she have a gun? If so, it's not needed. Mariana put the big bills into an envelope, about 20 100s, 2 packets of 50s, a bunch of 20s. Mariana asked, "Will there be anything else, ma'am?" With her gloved left hand, the robber took the envelope and dropped it into the handbag. Then she placed her right hand into the handbag, brandished a silver handgun, pointed it at Mariana's forehead. "Don't ever call me that, you old bitch." Then there was a distinctive click, but the gun did not fire. Consider yourself lucky. My advice to you, find another line of work. The blonde hissed. And then she was gone. So Mariana and I met for the next couple of years, helping her through this. And I have to say that looking back, I could have done much more for her. She left treatment stronger, but she was still troubled. Psychiatrists realized that outcomes for our patients are not the same as for the outcomes of a doctor of a medical specialty where the patient has appendicitis or a heart attack. Rarely is a patient with a mental problem cured. For Mariana, there was no fix. She came to accept that she would not forget the traumas of her past. She stopped fearing and hating all strangers, but while she was able to venture into the neighborhood alone, she couldn't bring herself to return to the main branch of the bank she had worked at and been robbed at, even in a position that had been created for her that would involve no contact with the public. And looking back on that, I think I would handle it differently. I would have been more of an advocate for Mariana, who got very little recognition. This next case is from chapter 6 in the book. It's combined physical and mental injuries. Ben is the firefighter in this story, and his is one of what I would call post-traumatic growth. So the title is, this chapter is "What Does Not Kill Me Makes Me Stronger." And it begins with, not all trauma victims remain victims. Not all those subjected to robbery, violence, and repeated abuse develop PTSD. Some have symptoms of an acute stress response, such as intense fear, insomnia, and startle reactions. But these unwelcome features dissipate in weeks or months, and a chronic disorder never develops. Like Mariana, whose story was depicted in chapter 1, Ben, another trauma victim, visited us in our office. He should best be viewed as someone who developed post-traumatic growth. So Ben's a battalion chief for a small firehouse in rural Northern California. His main duties involve managing the firehouse, including the equipment and personnel, while working 24-hour shifts. But his job also involves his being expected to assess large-scale fires through aerial surveillance. He's been trained to do this. And the reason he comes to see us is that California has a long fire season, and Ben was affected by one particular season. So he's up in a helicopter surveying the amount of personnel and equipment needed when the copter clips the top of a tree and crashes. A group of firefighters see the copter go down, and they drop their personal safety equipment to rescue their comrades. They're not supposed to do that. Ben is taken to a trauma center. When he regained consciousness at the crash scene, he couldn't move. He had broken his back and his left leg. He was trapped in the wreckage, and he realized that he was covered in aviation fuel in the middle of a fire. He also realized that he was severely wounded and was bleeding profusely. He recalls praying that he would bleed to death before the fire got to him. What happened was that he was rescued. He got out. He got taken to a trauma center. It took 20 units of blood products to stabilize him. He had a lumbar fusion after a disc was taken out of his back. He had a rod put in his left leg where his femur had been broken 9 places. And he got addicted to OxyContin to help with the pain. It brought on some other bad effects. And while learning to walk again, he had one thought that he became obsessed with, which was kill the pilot. What tormented Ben was learning that the copter pilot never should have been on the mission. His flight history had been misrepresented. He didn't have the requisite experience to fly in a massive conflagration. He had not heeded the instructions given before takeoff to dump or burn off fuel because of conditions present. As a result, the helicopter was too heavy and could not produce sufficient lift to clear the tree line. Because of the crash, Ben had come close to death, and his life would never be the same. But call it an aha moment, or perhaps an epiphany. 1.5 years after the crash, Ben realized if he were ever to fully heal, he would have to forgive the pilot. Was it a spiritual awakening in a man not particularly religious? Ben took steps to accept the traumatic event and its outcome. His daily use of opiates was tapered off, and he eventually discontinued them. He started venturing out from the room in which he had cloistered himself. He looked into returning to work and found himself welcomed when he did so. This story of tragedy and redemption was painful. Ben is left with chronic pain and significant physical limitations. He gets dejected and finds himself feeling what he calls tight when learning of fellow first responders being in harm's way. But he's also renewed an appreciation for life. He's an example of a man who was traumatized but does not remain a victim. He travels more with his spouse. He's closer to his adult son. He's renewed his interest in black and white photography, and he teaches and mentors young firefighters. Because of the resilience or mettle he has demonstrated, Ben was recognized with the Courage Award given by the California Society of Industrial Medicine and Surgery. It's given to an injured worker who's shown remarkable perseverance in returning to workforce after serious trauma. Not all victims remain victims. And this is one of Ben's photos. I know it looks rather macabre, but he's gotten back into his black and white photography. It's a burl of a sequoia in California. So I think this is the point where I was going to ask.
Yeah, Dr. Bob, what in the world got you into this profession?
Yeah. So Jessica is pointing out something, like you hear about someone, they be a concert pianist, they dreamed about it since they were 7 years old. That's not my case. I don't think that's the case for most people. With my roots, I think I probably would have been better off being a math teacher, a Finnish carpenter, maybe a family doctor, if anything. But when I went back to Chicago in medical school, I did stay with my music, and I could have been a jazz musician. In any case, mentors and events change us. So I became what I am because of the people and the experiences that I had that showed me this path to take. So I'm going to tell you a story here from chapter 5 entitled House Calls. You probably didn't know that psychiatrists made house calls, but this one has. And I came to New Mexico from Chicago toward the end of medical school. And I spent some time in Albuquerque doing a rotation entitled Indian Mental Health. And I would go and make house calls with my professor, who was a psychiatrist. And I'm going to tell you a little bit excerpts from this one particular visit that we made to one of our patients. So we'll keep it on that. Okay. All right. This picture here is not the patient's house. That's just my representation of a house as such. So it was a warm afternoon when a professor of psychiatry and I drove up to the very modest adobe home in a semi-rural section of Albuquerque, some distance from downtown and the UNM Medical Center. We were greeted outside by a 45-year-old Pueblo Indian named Johnny. He was expecting us. His fenced-in yard was mostly gravel and weeds. 2 dogs lay in the shade. I followed Johnny through his wide-open front door. I took a seat in a wooden chair with arms in a simple living room. I was introduced to Johnny as a visiting medical student who would be listening in on the session. I had read through his chart the night before, and on the drive over had discussed his case with my professor. Johnny had been in and out of psychiatric hospitals over the previous 20 years for episodes of psychosis and related to substance abuse involving alcohol and amphetamines. The prior year, Johnny had completed a drug treatment program, and he remained sober while regularly attending AA meetings. For the last 6 months, he'd been living alone in a tiny house his family owned. He wasn't working, but remained involved in the Pueblo where he'd grown up. He was welcome to participate in dances performed by men of the Kiva that he'd first entered with his father as a boy. Johnny made it clear that he did not like to travel to the medical center or even to the clinic close to his home. We were visiting him to make sure he was taking his medication. We also were interested in seeing how he was taking care of himself. I recall he was in a pleasant mood. He'd received notice that his application for Social Security disability benefits had been approved, which meant he no longer had to be dependent for assistance from his family. He showed us his pill bottles containing an antipsychotic and a mood stabilizer. He took them twice a day as instructed. He no longer needed antabuse to maintain his sobriety. Over the past week, he'd attended 3 12-step meetings, and he denied hearing voices or having evil thoughts. I'd never been to a house with dirt floors before. There was some order to it, but it was a bit dusty. The windows needed cleaning. The living quarters weren't my style, but things seemed orderly. The Indian baskets hung on the walls, and a bookcase held clay pots typical of those fashioned at his Pueblo. And Johnny had a pot of beans cooking in the kitchen, which smelled pretty good. And I was feeling quite comfortable with our visit when Johnny interrupted my professor and said the following: "You might want to tell the boy there's a snake under his chair." I saw the doctor look toward me and become silent. I was aware that at times Johnny had been delusional. He also had a reputation as a jokester, according to his chart, but that didn't make him a liar. Rather than show disdain for his warning by sliding my feet under the chair, I bent over to take a peek. And to my surprise, there was a very large western diamondback all coiled up and gazing at me, with its head and its tail looking straight at me. But the rattle was silent. Using the arms of the chair, I levitated With my feet coming to rest on the seating surface of the chair, Johnny stood up, went outside, and returned with a shovel. He walked straight at me and bent down to scoop up the rattler. After turning toward the doorway, he passed by my professor, who remained silent. Johnny tossed the snake into the yard. "I've been trying to get that fellow all morning," he stated. The session ended within minutes, and I have no memory of what else took place. That visit to Johnny's home was certainly unlike any consultation that might take place back home, my hometown of Chicago. Okay, so I became an occupational psychiatrist. We have a couple more of these little vignettes, these what I call tales, and some may ask, well, why do you call them tales, Dr. Bob? That implies that they're not completely, based on facts. Well, how do I know what is factual? I know what people tell me. Sometimes I get corroboration through records, but people tell stories, and that's what they tell me is their tale, and that's what you're hearing. So this fourth tale comes from chapter 23, and it has to do with something that is not exactly near and dear to our hearts, but something that is often in the news these days: gun violence. This is a story entitled, and the chapter is entitled, "We Have a Problem with Guns." Maybe not all of you agree with me on this, but this is my perspective. Having spent 5 years working in a busy emergency room and working with first responders, I want you to hear this story about Amir. Amir is a police officer who got sent to see me. As we lead into that, let me just mention, nearly 40,000 Americans die from gunshot wounds each year. This includes homicide, suicide, self-defense, and accidents. There are no accurate statistics on the number of people shot each year in the United States due to restrictions on federal funding of pertinent research. Yeah, that's true. It's estimated that twice the number of victims who die approximates the number who are injured yet survive. So we're talking about 100,000 people are shot. In a good month, it's 7,000 or 8,000. In a bad month, more than 10,000. So 300 people are victims of gunshots in this country every day in and day out. Amir was a 42-year-old immigrant from Afghanistan. He came to live in California with his family at an early age. He did well in the public school system and went on to take college coursework. After receiving an associate's degree in criminal justice, he applied to police departments in the Bay Area. He completed his police academy training after being accepted as a member of the Oakland PD. Throughout a career of more than a dozen years, Amir was assigned primarily to patrol duties. Like his peer group, he worked different shifts throughout an urban landscape that included industrial areas, commercial zones, high-end residential neighborhoods, and ghettos. He was physically fit and had a reputation with other cops as a stand-up kind of guy. A woman had filed a complaint with the police, alleging that her boyfriend had brutally raped and beaten her. A medical exam and rape kit were conducted. The preliminary investigation concluded there was probable cause to arrest the boyfriend. Amir arrived down the street from where the suspect was known to reside. Another officer was in a separate vehicle at the other end of the block. A young adult male ran back into the residence next to the suspects. Seconds later, the suspect emerged from his home, armed with an AK-47 assault rifle. He got off a volley of fire, having been alerted to the officer's presence. Amir, with gun drawn, took a round in his hip. The suspect proceeded to light up the squad cars. While a call went out for backup from other police units in the area, Amir crawled to the side of the building away from where the suspect had been shooting. It was dark, yet in the dim light, Amir soon saw the suspect burst out of the side door yelling, "Come kill me, you mother effers." He still had the AK-47. If he saw the officer, it would be all over for Amir. The officer took aim while he lay bleeding on the pavement. Later, he recalled thinking at the time, "Is this a justifiable shot?" Then he fired 4 times, hitting the target with 3 rounds that ended the alleged rapist's life. By the time I had seen Amir, a year had passed. His wounds had healed as much as they were going to. He had permanent chronic pain and a foot drop because of the nerve damage in his leg. The decision had been made that he would have to retire. And I was seeing him for the emotional sequelae, put it that way, of this incident. Amir was grateful for the support of his department. He also had a loving family who was glad he had made it. He accepted that his life had changed irreparably. He had no guilt about the outcome. He didn't regret having pursued law enforcement as a career. He realized he could benefit from more counseling, but he felt he'd be better off not revisiting the incident. When we met, he was considering his options for alternative employment. He was determined to be productive and a model for his kids. More than ever, Amir had a sense of pride as an immigrant who had been of service to his new homeland. For me, what I get out of this is it's the kind of story that I tell legislators about when I'm trying to convey to them some reasonable limits that should perhaps be put on gun ownership. And maybe someday things will change because, in my opinion, for what it's worth, enough is enough. And then we're going to end on a hopeful story. The last one for today's readings. Tale number 5 from chapter 17, entitled, "I Am Unlovable." Okay, so this is a story of another immigrant, a young woman I call Miss Fan. And she came to this country when she was a young girl from Vietnam after its civil war had ended. And she went through the public school system here and became an honor student and went and got a college degree and was supporting the husband that she met during college. And this is the story of the young woman who was working in a meat processing plant when she was injured. Okay. So working alone in the plant's lab, this young scientist attempted to dislodge bits of meat tissue caught on the side of what I call a meat grinder. It was a high-speed centrifuge. She did so with great care while the machinery was in operation. Even so, her right hand was caught in the grinder. Immediately, she reached for the kill switch with her non-dominant hand, but it was too far away. No one was around. The machinery was powerful and began pulling her hand into its clutches. She screamed for help. After quickly removing her shoe, she extended her leg in an effort to contact the switch, but failed again. She eventually passed out while coworkers managed to get into the lab and extract her mangled hand and arm from the grinder. She was taken to San Francisco General, which is a trauma center, and she awoke with no arm. I saw her about a year and a half after this had happened. Ms. Pham did not complain when filling out forms in our office. The test results made clear she was struggling with depression, anger, and anxiety. It seemed that her capacity to cope had been overwhelmed. I considered the potential need for hospitalization to stabilize her fragile state of mind. Despite her depression, she was well-groomed and exceedingly polite. Yet throughout our meeting, she intermittently sobbed while averting her gaze. When asked how she would describe herself following the injury, she slowly articulated 3 words: I am unlovable. My heart was broken. I could see that what the attorneys, having referred her to our office, wanted was to settle her case. They wanted to know, just as they had asked the orthopedist, how much is this worth? How bad off is she? And I was not going to really let that happen. I asked them where the Cal OSHA report was. California has an OSHA aside from the federal OSHA, and a serious injury like this should have required an investigation. There was no report of that. In a case in which the workplace is unsafe, like keeping a kill switch at a distance from a worker that you can't reach the kill switch, there are penalties for that for employers. So by my asking these things, I made it clear to them that I knew that there was more that could be done here for this young woman. The prosthesis that she had been given was rubber. The skin color didn't match her skin color. The rubber didn't match her skin color. And it served no functional value, but she didn't complain. So I had to complain for her. And I said that if they were going to settle her case today and they wanted to know how disabled she was 100% permanently disabled because she really viewed herself as unlovable. And that was a big award. So I said, do a few things for this young woman. One was get her a real functioning prosthesis, not a piece of rubber. We met 15 months later. She came in smiling. She had given birth to her first daughter. She and her husband were still together. He was finishing up college and looking for jobs. She had been to a prostitution, and she was going to get a titanium computer-generated arm that would connect up with the nerve endings in her upper arm. She had been to a really good vocational counselor, and there was a plan that she would become a pharmacist. And I said, I think we can have one-armed pharmacists. So how this ended was much better than how it started. The healing process had moved forward. This formerly hopeless victim now had a future. Ms. Pham had adjusted to the lost limb. Future treatment was guaranteed, and her disability claims were settled. My job was done. More importantly, she was no longer unlovable. So those are our stories for today. I appreciate everybody's patience. These are the titles for the chapters. You can kind of get an idea how gruesome some of them are. Job titled Killer. Who will be your advocate? We don't work alone. Grieving the loss. There's one that's in here that's pretty tough. That's even worse than Miss Pham's. Raped with a gun. I guess there's sometimes it might be worse than being shot with a gun. So I will leave it at that. For those of you who live in the Santa Fe area, Garcia Street Books on Garcia Street, of all things, has the book. If you go in and ask for it, they will get you a signed copy. For those of you who live elsewhere, and I know there are those of you listening that live elsewhere, you can get the book on Amazon, either Kindle, the electronic version, or paperback. It's also now available. Ingram Sparks produces the book. If you go into a bookstore, they can order it for you if they don't have it. This is what they call the ISBN number. If you tell them it's Dr. Bob Larsen, tell them the title of the book, they can look it up. They can order the book for you. What's cool about that is if you do that, they might actually think that they should have other copies they could sell, which would be viewing me and my team a great mitzvah or favor. For those of you who get the paperback, you let me know, and I will get you these some of these cool bookmarks. So that concludes my formal remarks. You can keep in touch with me through the book's website or on Facebook, and I'll let Jessica take over.
Thanks, Dr. Bob. Do you mind unsharing your screen so we can see your face again?
Yeah. And then I have to hit this thing here. Look, I'm actually getting better at this. There we go.
Perfect. Slate has their hand raised. I'm going to allow you to talk.
Dr. Bob, this is Slate Stern. How are you?
I'm pretty damn good, my friend.
I have a question for you. What's the hardest case you've had?
You know, they're all harder for the people I see than they are for me, so that's not really very fair. The one, I mean, you know, I read people's records because ahead of time, because that's respectful. I expect the doctor should know, if he can or she can, ahead of time what we're dealing with. When I'm a patient, I want the doctor to know about me. When I see a person who's been paralyzed because of an injury, when I see this woman who was raped with a gun, what do I know about treating somebody raped with a gun? How can I, as a man, relate to that? And what it did in that case, which was very difficult, I had to convey what that was like, what this woman was going through. And it was a little edgy. There was another psychiatrist who had seen her and said she should get 3 sessions of counseling. And I said, I don't know what the right number is, but I'm pretty sure it's not 3. So my recommendation was they give her nothing, and that would be more honest. And she'd be given the message she was on her own and nobody cared. If they wanted to do something else, then what they should do is think about what the doctor who said she'd have 3 sessions, what he would want for himself if he'd been sodomized with a gun. The insurance company sent that doctor my report, and they wanted him to say, I got it wrong. And you know how that turned out? He said I was right, that he got it wrong. And she ended up with a lifetime award for treatment because nobody knew what she needed. So that was a hard case. And, but like I say, I think the people that I see, anyone would say that their case is pretty tough. They don't usually come to me because they're, like I say, the boss doesn't like them. So thanks for asking that.
Okay.
We have a question from Lewis. He asks, based on your work, how would you describe the state and welfare of workers in working America?
Well, I have a perverse perspective because nobody comes to me with a good story. They don't say, Dr. Bob, I'm here to brag and to tell you what I just got a raise and a promotion. There's stories of having been mistreated, abused, injured. And I relate to it because that's my heritage. My mother never went to high school. She was an immigrant from Italy, and she started working at 14 to support her family. My dad joined the military at 19 to get away from home before they bombed Pearl Harbor. So I grew up with parents who just basically mandated that we were expected to work. My great-grandfather died in an industrial injury. And what I would say to Lewis is things weren't good then either. You know what his family got? Deported. They gave him boat tickets back to Italy. So I think that we could do better. I think a system should reward the people who actually have the serious injuries and take care of them, and those that show amazing resilience, they should be recognized in a way that they're not now. They're forgotten.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. ND, I will allow you to talk if you'd like.
Hi, thank you for taking my comment. I'd like to ask what your perspective would be on lack of inclusivity in the workplace and the world as an injury. Lack of access, inclusivity. You can't get there from here. You can't. There's no ramp. There's no captioning. There's no accommodation, and so the person who has a different ability is left to feel that their differing ability becomes an injury as opposed to a part of normal life that many people experience. I'd like to hear your perspective on that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, it sounds to me like you know more about this than I do. I'm oftentimes trying to be a conduit to explain to a claims examiner or an attorney representing the employer or the insurer what this person's life is like now. When you talk about what ND is talking about here, I can think of examples of how people who've had serious injuries are just forgotten. I saw a respiratory therapist who did his job, and as a result of it, he had not been told there should have been precautions, and he was taking care of a person with a lung infection. Within days, while on a fishing trip, he started having a fever and sweats, the respiratory therapist. He called his wife, who was a nurse, and she said, "You need to get to an emergency room." He ended up having all 4 of his limbs amputated, all 4 limbs, because he had a fulminating streptococcal infection. He had to have 3 reconstructive surgeries on his face. He was forced to retire in his 40s. His wife continued to work. He was on Social Security, and he became Mr. Mom, taking care of their kids, and he volunteered in the community. I saw him because the insurance company, this is like 12 years after he had been exposed, they were responsible for his care. And they wanted to know whether they should be responsible for his having to go through a drug treatment program because he got addicted to opiates. Big surprise. And of course, I told them that they were responsible. And then I told the claims examiner that in my opinion, they were also responsible that he needed open heart surgery. And they said, "You're a psychiatrist." And I said, yeah, but I'm a real medical doctor too. And that same bacteria that caused him to have facial surgeries and amputations has eventually worn out the valve in his heart. And they said, "Well, doctor," I said, "That's fine. Get in an expert in infectious disease or cardiothoracic surgery. And I think they're going to tell you the same thing." And they said, "Well, okay, doctor, I'm not wanting to hear any of this." And I said, "I'm not done. To do the valve surgery, he's going to need a bypass coronary artery." And I was talking to a nurse for the insurance company, and she said, "Well, that's a family history." And I said, "But if you're responsible for doing the open heart surgery, your insurance company is responsible for being able to get him there. And that means you're responsible for the coronary bypass surgery." So I had just recommended about $1 million worth of treatment. And I never got another referral from that insurance company, but that's okay. That's okay. So people are forgotten, ND. People don't see you at times. They don't want to walk in your moccasins, as we say here in New Mexico. Walk a day in another man's moccasins, another woman's moccasins. And I don't know exactly what you're talking about, but I see all the time where people, once injured and having been productive, are ignored, or we don't want to see them. And it's too bad. I would say walk in those moccasins so you can feel a little bit better. I know it's helped. It's happened to me. It's happened to me. I've been a serious patient, and being a serious patient made me a much better doctor. So I'll leave it
Yeah.
at that.
I think that I see the inclusivity as the methodologies that create access for people, their tools. They may be, it may be hardware, it may be soft assistive technology, it may be a wheelchair, it may be a cane, it may be a service dog, it may be captioning. And with the pandemic, it's almost like there's been some leveling of the playing field that's created access, but there's also a level of inclusivity that I hope we don't lose as we build into this. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. If there's no more questions, just want to remind everyone that Dr. Bob Larsen's book is at Garcia Street Books, and as well as your public library to check out. So happy to have your book on the shelf, and thank you so much for providing this really informative.
I know we have to finish up. I know we
Yeah.
do. I could go and talk more, but you folks can all get the book one way or the other and read out the other stories. But I was reminded, one of the persons who came on early, Yale Jones, was a fabulous attorney in San Francisco, and his firm still does good work for people there. And I was reminded that Andy's question about the inclusivity made me think about advocates. Who will be your advocate someday if you ever need one? And only in San Francisco, I had a case of a woman who was a prostitute, and as a result of her activities was arrested, ended up in the criminal justice system, got a job, and was working with sex workers when she broke her sobriety and ended up back on the streets. And her claim was accepted. And as a result of it, she was rehabilitated, got a master's degree in health policy from San Francisco State, and is now a leading advocate for sex workers. Talk about inclusivity. And some would say, oh, that's disgusting. Look, we saved her life, the system did, and she's now out there helping others to be safe. I don't think that's a bad use of resources myself. So I was just following up with ND's very interesting, thoughtful question. And there aren't all these questions answered in my book, but I think you'll find it that the tales, some of them will speak to you.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. And thank you, Andy, for being here and lighting the fire under my booty to figure out how we can be more inclusive. So I really appreciate your input and being here. And I appreciate everyone for being here. Thank you. And thank you so much, a million times. Thank you, Dr. Bob.
Well, I'm going to say goodbye to everybody, but I want them to know in my mother's language, we would say arrivederci, or ciao, but I'm learning Toa, which is the language they speak in the Jemez Pueblo. And my Indian family there, the Yepas, they have I'm called Kene Vela, which is Toa for old dog. That's my name, old dog. And we would say formally, onaha means goodbye. If we were just going to be less formal, we would say denaha. So denaha to all of you who have come. Thank you so much from far or from nearby. Thanks for coming to Santa Fe this afternoon and hearing some tales.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. Everyone stay safe, read books, read Wounded Workers, and have a great night. Take care.